UrbanTalk would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record this podcast, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. We recognise and we celebrate our continued connection to country, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Hello and welcome to the 6th episode of the Planning Congress podcast. In partnership with the Planning Institute of Australia, UrbanTalk is once again hosting a special podcast series in the lead up to the 2025 National Planning Congress that will take place in Darwin, Garramilla Country between May 28 and 30. Through this podcast, we'll bring you interviews with key local and international speakers so that you can get a taste of what to expect at Congress. My name is Belinda Barnett, and I'm the podcast host. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Ika Trijsburg. Ika is the Director of Urban Analytics at the ANU Institute for Infrastructure in Society in the Crawford School for Public Policy. She's the Head of Democracy and Diplomacy at the Municipal Association of Victoria, a Research Associate with the Initiative for Peace Building at the University of Melbourne, and leads the Disinformation in the City project across 5 Australian universities, which she initiated within the Melbourne Centre for Cities. She was the lead author of the world's first Disinformation in the City Response Playbook in 2024, which she created with 40 cross-sector experts globally. At Congress, Ika will be giving a presentation titled Disinformation in the City: What it means for planning professionals, in which she will explore the significant implications for planning professionals as targeted campaigns are waged against specific city initiatives and infrastructure. Ika will then host a masterclass called Disinformation in the City, Developing a 3-Phase Response, which will draw on the recommendations in the Disinformation in the City Response Playbook. Welcome, Ika.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here.
Well, it might be entertaining to hear a good conspiracy theory. This is an incredibly important topic that you're presenting at Congress. In January this year, the World Economic Forum released the 2025 Global Risk Report that identified misinformation and disinformation as the top short-term risks for the second consecutive year, underlying their persistent threat to societal cohesion and governance by eroding trust and exasperating division within and between nations. Mis and disinformation are often used interchangeably, but in the Disinformation in the City Response Playbook, you distinguish disinformation from misinformation by the intentionality behind it. Disinformation, sometimes also called fake news, as well as propaganda, is deliberately created to harm, mislead, or invoke an emotional response in a target audience, whereas misinformation is information held and shared without intent to harm, often due to unconscious bias or by accident. So to start, Ika, how do we tell when information or a narrative that has been created and disseminated is deliberate? Does it matter, or are they treated as one and the same?
That's a very important and interesting question, and of course a great place to start. In terms of whether or not disinformation and misinformation can be easily distinguished from each other, at times it's entirely impossible for people to tell the difference. But the intent is very important when we're looking at addressing disinformation and understanding it. So disinformation, or the deliberate, intentional sharing of fake news or of falsehoods with intent, has 2 major drivers, one of them being political and one of them being economic. And so when we talk about political, we're not talking about censorship. We're not talking about trying to progress a particular political agenda. What we're talking about is disinformation or erosion of the information environment and integrity in the information environment for political intent. So that could be foreign interference. It can be about deliberately creating distrust or chaos or confusion, because if a population doesn't trust each other and it doesn't trust its institutions, it's a lot easier to manipulate. So that's what we mean. We're not just talking about one specific party versus another specific party. Obviously, there are political actors that also do use disinformation. But then also we have economic actors that use disinformation. And again, those are really deliberate. There are powerful economic incentives behind that. There's clickbait. There's a lot of money to be made in clickbait or in sensationalist fake headlines or in manipulated content, like even things like there was recently fake photos, deep fake photos created of Katy Perry attending the Met Gala. So something seemingly as innocuous as that is representing her in a fake situation. She was not in attendance and she did not wear those things, but it purely is economically driven. There's also social media engagement and the algorithmic bias that promotes engagement with disinformation, and also the increasingly insular information environment that we experience online. And then there's the powerful economic interests in certain sectors that have an interest in inhibiting certain transitions or creating transitions in a certain direction, for example, in the area of renewable energy. So when we're looking at disinformation and what's causing it and what the response might look like, it's very different when we look at those deliberate actors versus someone who might have heard something from their neighbor, and their neighbor seems like a pretty smart person, and so they take that on board and they act on that. That said, at some point, disinformation does become misinformation. At some point, someone does hear it and takes it in good faith and continues to share that. When that's done, and when we're addressing that, we need to address it differently. But at the same time, misinformation in that context can be just as damaging if we think of things like anti-vaccine disinformation. At the micro level, whether or not someone knows it's inaccurate, knows that it's part of a concerted campaign, if that's the driver behind making decisions around potentially life-saving healthcare, then that's equally damaging.
Let's talk about, I guess, disinformation in the context of the city. Myth and disinformation may not be something people immediately associate with planning. They might more commonly associate it with media, science, and what you mentioned, politics. Can you give us a brief overview of how myth and disinformation is affecting the planning profession, and how you even begin introducing this audience to the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think disinformation has really burst onto the scene in the world of planning. It's not something that traditionally has been associated with this sector, but we've had some really significant global campaigns in the last few years that have really shed light on the implications for this sector. One of those was the very high-profile 15-minute cities conspiracy theory that began with a policy resolution in the city of Oxford and really rapidly spread around the world and drove a lot of distrust and fear in the urban planning concept of 15-minute cities, which is a relatively innocuous concept of creating livable spaces where people have access to their everyday needs within 15 minutes walk or cycle, but which became conflated with government control and a fear that the government was going to lock people into their neighbourhoods. Likewise, the 5G telecommunications rollout, again, huge infrastructure of relevance to planners, was marred by disinformation at a time when the world was grappling with the COVID-19 pandemic, and a conspiracy theory emerged around the 5G towers actually transmitting COVID-19. Again, this drove very real fears and led to a number of arson attacks around the world and physical attacks on engineers who were working on those towers. So these are the sorts of things that are happening that are of very direct consequence to planners. They're impacted by the success or failure of these projects, but they're also engaging with the community constantly. And planners and community engagement are the entire informational context within which that now occurs has profoundly shifted to what it used to be. Now we have increased division. We may have a group of people who are part of a public participation process who actually are accessing completely different information or narratives related to a project. And so there's a lot more complexity to that process than there was. And this impacts people's trust or sense of legitimacy in the project, and it impacts social license to operate. And so there are all sorts of different ways that the planning sector is really deeply impacted by this issue.
How much of a threat, and I think I know what your answer is going to be to this question, but how much of a threat would you say disinformation poses to planning when compared to other major challenges facing the profession that typically might get more attention in the public arena, like the housing crisis and sustainability?
I don't like to rank significant challenges, but as you said at the beginning, the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report literally has ranked global risks, and once again this year named mis and disinformation as the top global risk of the immediate term. And I don't think that it is so significant that that has been ranked the highest risk at a time when we've got active warfare in many places around the globe. We've got the climate crisis, we've got economic woes, we've got rising inequality, all sorts of things. For mis and disinformation to be ranked as the top global risk is very, very significant. It's interesting though, because in my world, I feel like everything's about misinformation and disinformation all the time. But yes, the housing crisis and sustainability and all these things, they're much harder for us to address because these are collective challenges. And if we don't trust our institutions and we don't trust our information and we don't trust each other and we don't even trust our own eyes when we're seeing things, how do we collectively rise to any of these critical collective challenges? And I think that's why mis and disinformation are such a significant risk, because they are overlaying all of these other challenges that we're facing at a really critical time in our history.
And I guess disinformation is going to hinder the response that we have to other pressing challenges like the housing crisis and sustainability and climate resilience, when it all comes down to the quality of the information that has been put into the public arena and who is putting that information out there. It's all interrelated, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's eroding the social fabric that we rely on. When we talk about things like sustainability and climate transitions, we need everyone to act on those. And we need everyone to trust that they can do that. We need people to enter into that in good faith. And at the moment, that's something that is being diminished, specifically around sustainability and climate resilience. We're seeing ways that climate disinformation, which is now an entire subfield of disinformation, it's so significant, is really driving not as much the denialism space now, but certainly delayism. And we've seen that in some recent disasters, and disasters are becoming a really critical lightning rod for disinformation because of the increased emotion, the fear, and the challenges that people can have in accessing information, or the way that we might all scurry to different sources to try and get quicker information as we're able to. And we're seeing that those situations are being used for foreign interference to manipulate sentiment, but also to really progress that climate denialism and delayism agenda. There's been a number of claims in recent events in Australia and also in the United States that human involvement, that there's been cloud seeding that's actually caused extreme weather events, whether it's flooding in Australia or the hurricanes last year in the US, and really calling into question the scientific evidence around the relationship between extreme weather events and climate change, and really using, again, those opportunities to try to drive that narrative and continue to cause confusion and questioning of what's really a very well-established scientific almost consensus at this point.
Yeah, it's very disturbing and alarming when we hear that, scientific evidence is being called into question, because so much of, I guess we've been moving to in planning has been evidence-based planning and evidence-based planning decisions. So now to see that being, greyed and murked is very, very disturbing. The Disinformation in the City Response Playbook recognises that cities are essential to the fabric of modern society. What will happen if we don't combat disinformation at the city level? How will it harm our cities?
I think it will harm our cities. I think it will harm our entire society. There was a great quote actually from the playbook that references cities that can be the laboratories of democracy, incubating and testing innovative ideas, methods, and approaches to engage and empower their residents in governance. However, the global challenge to liberal democracy posed by disinformation is eroding trust and social cohesion in cities and threatening the broader national democratic frameworks in which they are embedded. And I think one of the reasons why that's so important is because it's two-way. So cities are really impacted. We're seeing city leaders being impacted individually. We're seeing deepfakes. We're seeing impact on elections, we're seeing impact on policy making, but we're seeing impact at the city level of disinformation related to policy making at the local level, but also at the national level. And so we're seeing this crossover of activities and drivers in disinformation between levels of government, but people experience it in the local. If we feel like we're not part of society, we feel that in our everyday experience walking down the street. If we see graffiti that is related to disinformation campaigns, which is one of the ways that it does manifest in the local, or if we see posters or we see a letterbox drop, all those things we experience in the local realm. Most of the places, most of the services we will access will be in our local area. And so it's critically important to be able to recognize this local experience of disinformation. At the same time, cities are agile. They're deeply embedded. They're great collaborators with each other. There aren't the same kinds of foreign policy challenges and dynamics that might occur between national level governments where there are issues of sovereignty. Cities love collaborating with each other, whether it's with the neighbouring council or whether it's with a city abroad. And that's a real strength as we're rapidly trying to get the knowledge and the capacities and exchange around how we actually address an entirely unprecedented challenge. And I think there's a reason why community resilience has been devolved to the local level for a lot of policymaking. You know, climate resilience is devolved to the local level, community resilience in general, because of that connection to the local, because we do have that locally nuanced understanding of place. We are all different in the way that we interact with each other. Each city, each suburb has its own identity. And so recognizing that, drawing on the strength of that and harnessing that in responding to disinformation. But that said, it has to be multi-level, because cities are not going to be equipped in the near term, nor should they be, in the same sorts of specialist areas that the national government or the state government is. There is no intelligence apparatus at the city level for most cities. There are a few, you know, very globally significant cities, but for the most part, that's not a core capacity. And there's a number of other areas where there really needs to be that really clear opportunity for local, state, and national government, and supranational in many cases, to actually work together and harness the specific capacities of each of them.
Are we starting to see that collaboration, do you think, in Australia? Is misinformation and disinformation on the local, state and national policy agendas?
It absolutely is. And that's one of the really exciting things. And Australia is a member of some supranational committees specifically focused on this and focused on how national and subnational governments can work together to achieve meaningful response to disinformation. So I think we're extremely well placed in that area, but we're still working on how this best fits together when it's parts of these three levels of government that also haven't historically necessarily worked together, because this hasn't been the way that they've needed to work together. And so forging those new pathways needs a lot of specific consideration.
Why do some disinformation campaigns become so widespread? Why do they gain momentum so quickly? And can you provide an example?
So, I mean, disinformation campaigns, when there's powerful political or economic drivers, there's a significant incentive in getting big quick, having broad reach. We have the combination now of extremely broad reach from social media and extremely high capacity, unprecedented high capacity in generating anything we want from artificial intelligence. And so I could send out 10,000 different disinformation campaigns today if I wanted to. And I can constantly refine those until there's one that's going to generate me the income that I want. And that's one of the things that really is a significant amplifier in this space. And they do tend to follow societal fault lines. There are particular narratives, particular rifts within our societies, like our existing prejudices, our existing distrust, our fear, our grievance narratives, These are the things that those people who are creating disinformation know that we're most likely to buy into, because it's already an existing sentiment that we want to buy into, and use very, very specific manipulative techniques to do that. Groups then also work together. So we see that a lot with very organized groups, particularly when they're groups that might sort of span multiple conspiracy areas, and they work in concerted efforts to spread that into other places. And so that gives very rapid and very broad reach to these campaigns. A current example, which is impacting planners in many areas, is around offshore wind farms and the false narrative. There is no scientific basis that's been established for this, that sea life and particularly whales are harmed by the establishment of offshore wind farms, and also that human life is harmed, that there are health consequences to wind farms. And these cause very significant fears in the community, and can be incredibly divisive, and can make it very difficult to move forward again with renewables. There are very frequently renewable transitions are the targets of disinformation campaigns.
Let's talk a little bit and move on to the response, and I guess some of the key information that's available in the Disinformation in the City Response Playbook. Where does the responsibility fall in responding to disinformation in our cities? Is it planners, the government, community leaders, the media? Maybe it's a collaboration of all.
Yes, it is. It's a collaboration of all of them. So one of the things that when the 40 of us got together to write the playbook together, we were all from different disciplinary and sector backgrounds. We had people there from the tech sector and media and civil society and academia and different levels of government. And we identified just how critical it was that we were engaging with all of our sectors in an effective and deliberate way, that we weren't just collaborating for collaboration's sake, but actually identifying what each of those different sectors brings in terms of capacity, in terms of legitimacy. There are some sectors that are far more legitimate with parts of the community than government.
Which are they?
Well, business leaders, for example. There are some parts of the community that will listen to a business leader before they will listen to a politician. Likewise, there are some parts of the community who will listen to someone in the health profession before they will listen to a politician. And so there are a number of different ways that we need to recognise that, and also build on the capacity of each of those. So in the playbook, we've proposed a very, very collaborative model for disinformation response, which includes the three or four, depending on the national context, levels of government working together, but also cities working together. So at the domestic scale and also internationally, to make sure that information and initiatives are being rapidly translated and grafted across contexts, and also that there's that collective impact, the collective efficacy of being not just one city requesting a meeting or raising an issue, but 100 cities raising an issue, and the collective heat shield that can come from that. Because when we're in an increasingly polarized context where political leaders are also experiencing huge levels of hostility and disinformation directed towards them often, it can be very hard to say, well, now's the time to try something new. And so actually by working together, that can make the context safer for cities to say, okay, well, we're going to try this. We think it's going to work. These are the reasons why. It's evidence-based, but it's new. And this is why we're doing it. And they can support each other. And then with other sectors, there's obviously the media is critical in terms of not just what it can contribute to collective efforts, but also in terms of making sure that media is adopting and continuing in responsible media coverage. And sometimes, again, in the clickbait environment, it can be tempting to move away from that for certain outlets. And also civil society is hugely valuable for bringing community together, giving creating the conditions for a collective voice. Schools, education, we need to have a lot of embedded critical literacy. We've just had it brought into the Australian curriculum, but schools are a really key partner in this. But then so are things like health services, when health disinformation is a massive thing as well. And the health sector is actually one where most of us will continue to engage with those services throughout our whole lives. And so what a good opportunity to actually have those touch points for building critical literacy around health information, around other information. So there are many, many actors, that's just to name a few of them, that really need to be part of the disinformation response collective efforts.
In the playbook, you outline 3 phases to a disinformation response life cycle. And I know this is going to be part of your masterclass, so I don't want to steal your thunder. But can you, I guess, without giving too much away, what are these 3 phases of the disinformation response life cycle? Can you share that with us?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that we identified as a limitation of existing disinformation response was the temporal space within which it happened. So the time frame. We found that the majority of disinformation response was occurring either immediately when an incident happened, so debunking for the most part, maybe a little bit of pre-bunking, and sort of the immediate after effects. What we realized and what we've proposed through the playbook and through our other work is actually extending this continuum of a response. So it not just being about a crisis and not just being about communication in a crisis, but actually what are the things we can put in place to anticipate disinformation and to preempt disinformation. And this comes back to those fault lines that I talked about before, to understanding the trust landscape within a city or within a locality or within a project, because different people, different groups will trust different institutions. That's fine, but we need to recognize who they trust, and we need to make sure that everyone trusts an institution that's trustworthy. And we need to make sure they're working together. And there's other aspects of that as well that I won't go into the whole thing now, but that leads us into a space where we're then able to not just preempt, but also early detection. So detect disinformation much earlier so that we can then respond. And then the second phase is really that kind of response space, but early. So pre-bunking. So making sure that people have the tools they need to make sense of information when they do receive it. And containment or spread prevention. So something when disinformation does take hold, and disinformation is part of our landscape, it's going to happen. But when it happens, making sure that it doesn't become catastrophic, something that doesn't become like we saw in the UK last year, where the contagion of riots from city to city to city happened very, very quickly, and actually reducing that so we reduce the harm. And then following the event, debunking, as has now been established, which is the practice of helping people to understand what is the information they've received, why is that inaccurate, and what is the accurate information. And then building in, again, so extending the continuum, recovery. So recognizing that disinformation has a huge impact on communities and building in that recovery phase, just like we do with emergency management and other critical incidents, and resilience building. So kind of closing the loop there and making sure that we're really proactively building resilience so that the next time disinformation campaigns might hit our communities, we're actually in a better place to be able to respond.
You're talking about the containment of an issue. Can you give us like an example of how an issue would be quickly contained?
Well, there's a variety of ways that you can contain it. I mean, there's regulatory ways, and there's also, reaching out specifically to tech companies to remove content. So those are some of the quick things. But there's not all disinformation sits in Facebook groups, for example. Some of it does. There was a great project that was undertaken by Nordic Safe Cities, where they actually invited the moderators of all of the key local Facebook groups to come and receive disinformation response training
Excellent.
so that they can spot disinformation as it emerges in their Facebook groups. And they felt confident in how they could respond to that in a way that was going to maintain the focus and the nature and the energy that they wanted in their group, but wasn't actually going to lead it to become a damaging place in terms of the information that was exchanged there. And they found that to be really effective. So there's those sorts of things as well. There's offline things, there's working with different communities, community leaders, and there's sort of in the anti-rumor space and the alternative narrative space, which perhaps we can touch on in a little bit. There's all sorts of things that can be built into that actually just help to contain and sort of to shift that narrative away from becoming a really explosive, damaging, large-scale disinformation campaign.
One of the key themes in the playbook is trust. Planners are having to constantly generate information that goes into the public arena, whether that's, a new urban policy or an assessment report on a new development proposal. What can planners do to become a trusted voice in the community?
Well, let's assume that planners are a trusted voice in the community and will enhance that trust.
That's good to hear. That's a real positive.
The things that enhance trust are a lot of it comes back to basics, but recognizing that those basics look different for the very complex, diverse projects and communities that we're working for. So transparency and consistency and competence. Like these are three key pillars. They're pillars of good governance, they're pillars of good project management, but sometimes we can forget them. We can forget that people need to be aware of them in order to feel confident in the legitimacy of a project or of a leadership group. So transparency. Planners are great at sharing the information that they're required to about a particular project. Something we can all be guilty of is getting lost in the sense that everyone can understand the highly specialized language that we understand. And so actually recognizing that transparency of information goes beyond sharing just the information. It's actually about making it accessible for the different types of information needs that we might have across a community. And that's not just about translating it into different languages. It's also about making sure we have, most of us, particularly under a certain age in the community, will be accessing our information in reels or in very short snippets that may be presented to us on social media. How do we actually transparently create the information and share the information that we need to in that format so that people can feel informed about that particular topic? Likewise, with consistency, when decisions are made, often in planning, there are people who will benefit and people who will not benefit from those decisions. That's part of living in a community, right? Not every decision will immediately benefit us. But when we can demonstrate how that decision was made and the consistency with which those decisions are being, or decision making is being applied, making sure that who's involved is considered legitimate, making sure that that people do feel that they really can have a voice. And again, this might mean moving away from only being able to raise something in the chamber, for example, or only being able to raise it at an in-person town hall style meeting, but actually broadening the ways that people can participate and then see that consistency of application in action will really help people to increase their trust of that process. And then competence. This comes back to the perceived legitimacy and skills of those who are tasked with doing some of these really important, with undertaking these transitions, with building our major infrastructure, with governing our cities, with all of these things. If people feel that the informations that are being made based on evidence, that they're being made in a transparent way, they're being made in a consistent way, then people are likely to perceive that group as more competent. And those are the things that then are likely to encourage us to say, okay, well, if this is what you've come to, even if I don't immediately benefit from this decision, I'm much more likely to accept that than if I don't feel that any of these parts were in place.
So what I'm sort of hearing is that I think planners, we often communicate the outcome, but maybe we don't put the effort into communicating the process
Absolutely.
and really introducing, I guess, the credentials of the people behind the process so that you can, the community can really sit back and get that level of confidence that you're talking about that's so essential to trust and being a trusted voice.
Yeah, community expectations of public participation have changed. We now expect to have a lot more agency in the decisions that happen around us. And that means that people now do want to have a lot more oversight and understanding of the processes that are driving decisions. And the process is where the trust sits. That's where the trust is earned. It's not in the decision itself. It's the process that sits behind it, where the legitimacy is determined, where the trust is garnered. And I think that's something that, like you say, is frequently forgotten. And then we see the repercussions of that.
In the playbook, you use the term, and I love this term, and I'm dying to understand more about what it means, anti-rumour agent. Can you share with us what that term means?
So the anti-rumour agent harks back to some fabulous work that was done initially at the City of Barcelona, which has now become its own separate entity that's been taken across the globe, actually, under the auspices of Council of Europe and with their support. But it started as the anti-rumour campaign. And this was when there was a lot of anti-migrant disinformation and rumours, it was framed as, in Barcelona. And so they decided to look at where were the places that rumours, or in this case disinformation, were shared and who was doing it, but also who would be well placed to actually respond. Because so many conversations happen in bars or with hairdressers or with Uber drivers or in all sorts of places that are often not considered when we look at community engagement or these sorts of things. And so the anti-rumour campaign and their model looked at training up anti-rumour agents to be well positioned to both identify rumours but also to be able to respond. We're actually super excited at the moment to be working in partnership with the creators of the anti-rumour campaign and a number of others supported by European Commission and with the overarching leadership of ICE in Italy to pilot alternative narratives to rumours and to disinformation in cities across Italy, Spain, Portugal, Poland, and in Australia as well, to understand how do we work with people across the community, these agents and others, to deconstruct harmful narratives and reconstruct them together in ways that actually take us back towards the community and the city and the society that we collectively envision. What does that look like when you're working with very different demographics, very different challenges, and very different informational contexts? And it's a fascinating space. And I think that's one of the really wonderful contributions of city diplomacy as well, where cities are able to learn from each other from these sorts of initiatives, not just this one that we're working with at the moment, but also with City of Barcelona's initial work in that space and the way that that's been able to guide this work in a number of different contexts around the world.
Yeah, it's a really exciting project. And then what leads me to, I guess, the last question I have for you. At an individual level, what should we do to respond to disinformation?
Try not to share it is the first thing. So take a moment. A lot of us, we make very quick decisions about what we're going to share, often on social media. Most disinformation does have some touch point with social media. And so take a moment. And this is one of the things that's been used in government campaigns around the world to just encourage people to sit back and consider the context within which they're seeing a certain image or they're seeing a certain, often very sensationalist claim. We can do reverse image searches and all those sorts of things. But even if we're not going to go that far, to just sit back and think, hang on, this is something that seems very sensationalist. Is there a possibility that this is something that is being driven by perhaps economic interests, perhaps political interests? Why might I be seeing this? And then consider whether or not you want to share it, or whether or not you do want to do a little bit more investigation to see if it does seem to be legit before sharing it on. But if others are using disinformation and you want to respond to them, then you can also use the model that's in the Resist 2 playbook of the UK model, which of the UK government, which is very simple. It's just make sure that you're not amplifying the disinformation by responding to the disinformation. So always, it's like a fact sandwich, basically. That's my words, not theirs. But make sure that you start with the fact. So the truth, make sure the truth leads. If you're saying to me, for example, birds aren't real, which was a fictitious disinformation campaign that was launched, I can then respond to you with the truth. Birds are real. Then the fallacy that I know you're telling me birds aren't real, and then why that's a problem, or the context. So this was created as a false disinformation campaign. This is how it came about, and this is why it's detrimental to buy into it. And then finally, the truth again. So just to finish, birds are real. I'm looking at them right now, and they are entirely physiologically real. It's not a particularly compelling way of doing it, but basically having that truth sandwich is really important for making sure that you're not amplifying disinformation by sharing it as you respond.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Ika, for enlightening us on another pressing challenge for planners. It's an important subject with broader knock-on effects and one that feels particularly relevant. I think delegates will benefit from gaining a better understanding of this challenge and how to respond, because I can see this being an ongoing problem that needs to be met with a coherent strategy. I'm just glad that somebody like you has done the hard work of putting together the response playbook. So thank you for that and for your time today. And the disinformation in the City Response Playbook is available free of charge online. Congress is now upon us, so if you're heading to Darwin, make sure to take advantage of all of the fantastic presentations and workshops. To learn more, go to the Congress events page of the PIA website. If you have any questions, please email congress@planning.org.au. Follow the UrbanTalk podcast feed in your app of choice to hear more from this Planning Congress series or our regular podcast, and leave a review to help others find the show. If you're a developer or planner who needs help with community engagement, then get in touch with us at urbantalk.com.au. I'm Belinda Barnett, and thank you for listening to the Planning Congress 2025 podcast.